Jon Ledyard. You want to talk about a guy that knows ball? He's one of them. What's going on, brother? How are you?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Nah, I know you're a busy man, so thank you so much for making some time. What do you make of that? Stafford staying with the Rams? I thought it was kind of a weird marriage with the Giants if that was going to happen. It's not like they're a veteran quarterback away. And now Aaron Rodgers possibly not moving at all because they play in the same stadium, going from the Jets and the Giants. So, what do you make of those two veteran quarterbacks and their presence and futures?
Well, the Stafford thing makes complete sense, and I think the speculation kind of got out of hand with him. Where I understand that they let him look around, but I just think it was really, if you look around the league, it was really unlikely that there was going to be. It would have had to have been like some unpredictable move where a team that has a quarterback decides we're gonna chuck this guy or trade him or something like that and go after Stafford instead. Like that, it would have had to been a pivot like that, I think, that would have been made sense for Stafford to leave, because the top available options, I mean, just from wanting to not wanting to move across the country, I think that was a big part of this. Already, you limit your pool. The Raiders are maybe interesting a little bit, but they're not necessarily close. You probably got another year or two here to finish this thing out strong. It just never made any sense for it to be anywhere other than the Rams, really, unless something crazy emerged. So that one makes complete sense to me. I think that's always the direction it was likely to go in, even if some of the reporting and some of the messaging maybe got ahead of it in another direction. And then with the Rodgers thing, this is just, whoever is interested in Aaron Rodgers is just unbelievably desperate and has no other options. That was always how it was going to be this offseason. We've kind of known that since probably midway through last season. It was apparent he's not the same guy. The Giants certainly fit that bill, right? Their coach and their GM are both going to get fired if they don't have a dramatic turnaround this season. They probably have no other option at this position to really get better this offseason. So bring in a guy like Rodgers and try to make it work. I don't have any optimism for that at all. I think it's a disaster waiting to happen. I think Rodgers needs to hang it up, but they are the one team I think probably at this point that would be desperate enough to try and go after him. So, Rodgers probably doesn't care. He gets to stay in New York. That'd probably be the sweet way to work it out for him if he does want to keep playing.
Do you think that would preclude the Giants from taking a quarterback with that third pick? I mean, you look at the options there, and I think there's that growing sentiment that Abdul Carter might be the first guy off the board. But we know Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward, there's just a lot of differing information. Could teams trade up for him? Could they fall farther? I mean, it's kind of funky, but I wonder if, let's say the Giants bring in Aaron Rodgers, do you think that would stop them from taking one of those other two guys?
No, not at all. I think it's a completely separate thing, in my opinion, because Rodgers, I mean, he could easily play like 1 year. They really need somebody to save their jobs so that they ever get to do something with whoever they take at three. If it's another quarterback, that's the situation. So I think it wouldn't relate to it at all. I mean, perhaps they look at it and they just say, we don't like the quarterbacks, and it makes them more desperate to add Rodgers instead. Right. Maybe they love somebody else there that could be a huge piece to their team. So those are possibilities, but if they love one of the quarterbacks, I don't think adding Rodgers will change that.
Where do you fall as far as kind of the prospects with Ward and Shedeur and how they stack up with Abdul Carter? If you had the pick for Tennessee, would you go after one of the quarterbacks, knowing that kind of the jury is probably still a little bit on Levis, or do you say Abdul Carter, generational talent, he was that good with one arm in that last game? Like, where do you fall on that?
Yeah, I'm taking the best player available for sure, and I don't think that's the quarterbacks. Because to me, I think it's just such a long-term rebuild with the Titans. I mean, they made a lot of mistakes last offseason. I said that at the time, and it actually ended up worse than I even thought it would. The Titans they spent more money on free agency than any other team in the league last year in the offseason. So just a total guarantees, at least. Just a totally massive mistake. Calvin Ridley, L'Jarius Sneed, Lloyd Cushenberry, 3 massive contracts that they gave out. Cushenberry was okay. Sneed was disappointing. Ridley was disappointing / the offense was disappointing. He didn't produce at the level they paid him. So just really disappointing outcomes, I think, for spending that much money. Now, the Titans had a ton of cap space, and they still have a ton of cap space. So it's not like the end of the world for them. But now they've got to kind of get to a point where, okay, now we're going to recalibrate. Actually, we're not going to quick fix this thing. We're going to do this the right way. And so for me, I'm just trying to get the best player, because they're probably going to draft high again next year. So I'm just trying to add young talent at key positions at the top of the draft, trade down and get more picks if somebody's desperate to come up for a quarterback. But I don't love either of the quarterbacks to that level. I think there's questions about both of them. I do love their quarterback from a class from a couple years ago with the Kenny Pickett and all these guys. To me, they were missing a lot of intangibles that matter too at the position. And I actually think I like Ward and Sanders' kind of disposition. They've got a lot of bravado. I think there's some good things said about their leadership. There are some good physical skills in there, especially with Ward. I think Sanders' physical traits are fine to me. Like, I think people get too caught up with that stuff. To me, it's just like the speed with which you play the game. Is it fast enough? Because if you don't play with an internal clock in the NFL, you're going to get crushed. Sanders just has a very relaxed state in the pocket, which is fine in college, but in the NFL, you will just get killed if you try to play the way. He'll be like the 7 sacks in a game guy who also has like 3 or 4 really nice plays, and it's just a really hard way to sustain. And then with Ward, I think there's accuracy stuff that at times scares me a little bit, and I don't think he's on the level like Trey Lance in terms of that stuff, where that was a really scary part of Lance's evaluation. Some would say Anthony Richardson. I don't think he probably has quite the upside of those guys, nor is he quite as undeveloped as a player now because he's played a lot more. But I do think that there's some rough edges with him that will likely need to be ironed out too.
Yeah, that's kind of, I love what you said about Shador there, because I saw Dan Orlovsky say something yesterday of how bad the offensive line was for Colorado. So you look at what you just said of, well, do you look at it on one side and go, wow, man, even with the bullets flying, he was so calm and cool and under pressure, right? Or do you look at it as like, yeah, but you got to have some kind of internal clock where it's like, all right, I got to get the hell out of here. I got to move outside the pocket and be able to make a throw off platform. So, yeah, I'm with you. I cannot wait. Who do you think's that third or fourth quarterback? I mean, I know some people love Jackson Dart and they look at some of these other guys, but do you think if those guys those guys will go in the first round, but do you think any other quarterback sneaks into the first?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like Dart's going to be in there. I actually haven't watched Dart yet myself personally. Like I've watched a little bit of Sanders and a little bit of Ward, and then I've seen some of the other guys. So I thought Will Howard really did play well down the stretch of the season. I think everybody kind of acknowledges that, but I think it was really impressive. It wasn't like the rest of the team just carried him to that championship. I think he really played well. So I'm intrigued by him. I'd say as like a mid-round option, which is where it seems like sort of he's out on the radar right now. Haven't watched the Louisville quarterback enough to really be able to comment on him. I know a lot of people that I trust are kind of lower on Jackson Dart in the draft world, but it seems like teams are higher on him right now. At least some of that stuff in the past has been just smoke and mirrors, and the guy ends up going in the third round, and it's not that big of a deal. But so I would say those are probably the next couple guys that come off the board, and then I think it'll just be eye of the beholder. There probably are a lot of guys that can play in this class at quarterback, like be in the league and have a job. But I don't know if there's a lot of like starting material in this class. And that's where I think teams are going to have to weigh, where do you want to take that risk? Like, do you want to take that risk in day 2 or day 3 of the draft? Or are you going to be one of the teams that risk their first round pick on a guy who could potentially never help your team? It's just a tough year. You need a quarterback. You kind of almost have no choice at some points, but it's hard to feel like super confident in any of these guys compared to past years.
John, I want to ask you about the Bucs in a second, but I want to ask you about the Steelers. There's pieces there. Defensively, obviously have a coach like Mike Tomlin, one of, if not the most respected coach in the league. But last year it was like Justin Fields and Russell Wilson. Everybody knows what happened there. How do they attack this position in 2025? Because I look at some of their draft classes, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, it's not like they're hitting home run after home run after home run there on the offensive side of the ball. And they do need that signal caller. They haven't found that long-term solution since Big Ben retired. So how do they attack it in 2025 and beyond?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing with the Steelers is right now the outlook is bleak, and you have to kind of admit that because it's really hard to get better. Now they have cap space, they have a ton of it. We just dropped a podcast on this last night, but because looking at all the different ways they have space to improve in terms of spending, and they have options to potentially create more space too. If they extend TJ Watt, that actually creates a lot more space for this year. They could trade TJ Watt. They're not going to do that, but that should be more of an option that is actually discussed out there. It's not going to be because the Steelers don't think that way. And that brings us to kind of where we're at, is like there is just a lack of realistic outlook from Pittsburgh that inhibits their ability to actually get better and progress as a franchise. They believe truly somehow that they can compete in the AFC for a title of the conference. And They can't, and they're not there as a team. And until quarterback and offensive coordinator are better, they won't be. Those are, in my opinion, the two most important parts when it comes to on-field performance. Two most important parts of on-field performance are your quarterback and your offensive coordinator / play caller. If that's your head coach, then your head coach. But to me, that matters more than anything else. Because that's what drives winning in football is the people that put those groups over the top. And so I think that's just keep getting that part wrong. They keep getting it wrong they got it wrong with Matt Canada, with Kenny Pickett. They got it wrong with Mitch Trubisky. They got it wrong with it. They continue to since Ben. And I thought last year they got too okay, in Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. It was better, but again, it wasn't good enough. The quarterback play wasn't good enough. And the bench and Fields, the end of the year, they're sick of Wilson. He's definitely not their preference. Perhaps they're forced, as we talked about the Giants, into re-signing him, but it's not their preference. So they're just in a terrible spot. They've definitely checked in on the Stafford thing, and obviously now he's going back to the Rams, but he doesn't want to go across the country, as I mentioned. And so they've done their due diligence and at least inquiring about what's out there, but the reality is there's just nothing out there. And Stafford, I don't think many people believed there was a real strong chance he would leave the Rams. So in terms of realistic options, there just continue to not be any for the Steelers in terms of improvement at that position. And they continue to hire poorly at offensive coordinator. And so those two things are probably going to hold them back, even if the defense had been up to the level. I mean, they're highest paid defense in the league, and they weren't like an elite defense last year. They were like okay, and there were times they were okay, but mainly because they forced a ton of turnovers. And that is just not typically a sustainable way to play elite defense because turnovers can be very fickle. So they just have to do so many things better, even to raise their floor, and their ceiling, it just seems non-existent unless they could somehow upgrade an offensive coordinator or quarterback, which doesn't seem to be very possible this offseason.
John, if you put your Buccaneers GM hat on, how would you attack improving this defense, and whether it's through via free agency, the trade market, or the number 19 overall pick? How do you start going about getting this defense to a level where you can kind of match what's going on the offensive side of the ball, and you can get this team from being not just a division winner, but a Super Bowl contender?
I think you have to get really serious at a couple of positions, and you have to spend this offseason. I think I've completely supported their approach to be careful, just given the cap situation and where they were at. They've navigated those waters. They've navigated 2 tough post-Brady years with the cap, and gotten back to the point where they can start to go in and be aggressive again. Not many teams come out of a win now all-in window and are ready to compete again. I mean, really, they won a playoff game last year and were very competitive against the Lions, or 2 years ago. And then this past, I think very fluky game against Washington, I'll say. I'm not sure they were better, but easy path to see that game going differently. The Bucs ended up in the NFC Championship game. I do not think there's any fatal flaw with the team that would have kept them out from being able to compete with the Eagles last year. And we all know how they've done against the Eagles. So it's there. You might not say they're the betting favorite, and they aren't. And there's a way that it goes poorly, especially with Cohen gone now. I think there are real legit questions with the offense. We'll see what happens. But I think for the Bucs standpoint, they're not going to, if they go in assuming the worst, then they're obviously, they can't do that at this point in time. Right. So to me, you have to go all in. If you're the Bucs, you have to make a move to add a real difference maker to this defense. They have basically drafted their entire defense. They've been very hesitant, and especially the last couple of years, rightfully so, with where the cap was at, to add a real difference maker to the defense. But this year, I think that has to change, and they have to really explore and be aggressive to add real difference makers to this defense, whether this is actually a decent free agent crop for the secondary. It's not for really any other position. Can you get in on that group at all? I talked about Charvarius Ward being a potential addition for this team that probably wouldn't even cost that much at this point because he's coming off a bit of a down year, and there's been obviously some stuff with him that's made it very hard for him, I think, on the field. But I think that if he's ready to return from some of that stuff, that he could be an upgraded player. There are a couple names I wrote about for them, but I think they have to get really serious about adding 3 or 4 legit pieces to this defense in the offseason. And if they bring Godwin back, and I think the offense takes care of itself. Obviously, if you're in position to draft a stud, I think you draft one. That's a different story. But to me, in free agency or via trade, I think you have to get serious about trying to add another difference maker on the edge. I would be in on the Trey Hendrickson conversations if they're to be had. I think that needs to happen. Don't know whether they'll do that or not, but it does seem like Todd Bowles has been more vocal than ever before that we have to get Rush with 4. if we don't get rushed, we cannot blitz. And he didn't want to blitz. Last year, first half of the year, he blitzed less. He didn't want to go that route. And then second half of the year, he just screw it. Like, we got to go all in when blitzing. That's who we are. It's the only way we can get pressure. So to me, that is the key. Like, can they find people? Yes, the secondary matters. And, ultimately what they do with Dean is probably going to determine whether there's a true starting spot there or not. But you need linebackers. Even if Levante comes back, you need to add 2 playable players there. I think at linebacker, one probably at least in the draft, and you need to add another player up front that makes a difference. And then we'll see what happens with Dean and the rest of the secondary.
John, you're one of those people that when you were here, you made such a profound impact that people still say, man, Jon Ledyard, we miss him, man. You missed the job that you're doing with Pewter Report. And man, every time I see you, you're working with somebody else and somebody, Carmen, and doing stuff with our guy, Tampa Bay Trevor Sickman. Let everybody know, obviously Ledyard NFL Draft on Twitter/X, but just let everybody know what you have going on. Cause this is a legit question that I've been asked. Like, hey, you talked to Jon Ledyard? I'm like, yeah, man, we keep in touch, man. Yeah. And, cause I remember you and I think we had you on the air on DAE, like your last time being on air before you guys moved, and there was a lot of people, man, and it's cool to say that we're friends and to like you made an impact, man, and that's really, really cool. And I hope that that resonates with you and your family, that even though you're not here in the Tampa Bay area, people like still care about your wherewithal and they trust your opinion on things. So let everybody know how they can find you, where they can hear you, because I know it makes them a whole heck of a lot smarter when it comes to football.
Well, I appreciate that a ton, Jay. I mean, that's the biggest thing when we were there in Tampa. Everybody in the media market, the fan base, everybody like open arms, so welcoming. I wasn't a Tampa Bay native or anything like that. Never was made to feel like I didn't fit in or was less than or anything, just because I hadn't covered the team or been around the team my whole life. And so, yeah, hopefully that people recognize that I was watching every game of the last couple seasons before I got there. So I had a strong understanding of what I was stepping into from a roster standpoint and asking all of you questions. Hey, what's the dynamic of this guy? Like, is he fitting in, all those kinds of things. And the Bucs media, I mean, Tampa Bay media, like I've been in a lot of other cities, it's just an unbelievable, awesome group of people. And so, yeah, unbelievably grateful for the time there and miss the heck out of all of you. As Greg and Jenna and everybody are always reminding me like, hey, come back and visit and stuff. And we definitely plan to, but yes, still covering the Bucs and still doing Bucs stuff and NFL content. Audibles and Analytics is my Substack. It's like $5 a month or $50 for the year to subscribe. So I try to keep the price down as much as I can. That's like, in season, it's like 4 podcasts a week, and it's lots of written content and stuff. I usually write a film article on the Bucs each week in season, and then do a Bucs podcast with Josh Capo, who I know you had on recently as well. So I would say like those are the big Bucs things. And then in draft season, like right now, doing scouting reports consistently, and then Ollie Connolly and I are recording a couple times a week, talking prospects pretty in depth. We do about 3 to 4 hours a week on prospects. It might be a little too much, but that's how it rolls when we talk about football. So we're just scouting a bunch and doing that. And it's all kind of just in addition to my full-time job, which has a lot of flexibility in the non-summer months, but in the summer I'm pretty locked in. But if people want to subscribe, Audibles and Analytics is the Substack platform that they can subscribe at, and they can check out and get access to all of that work just for the $5 a month, or for the $50 a year. You get the draft stuff, the Steelers stuff, the Bucs stuff, and then the general NFL podcast that Ollie and I do twice a week in season as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm telling everybody on social media, lay off our guy Josh Capo. I thought he had a good point about Vita Vea. And
that was funny, wasn't it?
Nobody listened to the video, and I was like,
that's
wow,
what
I had to stop him. I was like, wait a second. I was like, are you saying this? And people are like, oh, they're saying the Bucs are moving on from Vita Vea. I'm like, no.
He's in 2 years.
2 years. Jeez. And you don't get healthier when you're that heavy and you're post 30.
Yeah, this is what it is. I mean, 32-year-old nose tackles are not a hot commodity in the NFL. So if he's back after the next 2 years, I think it would be because the price is really low. But I think, Josh is right. And they'll think about that in this draft, but earnestly in next draft. I mean, if there's a great player available and this is a really good nose tackle group, it could be in this draft, but I think definitely by next one, they'll be looking pretty heavily at that position.
No doubt. Twitter/X Ledyard NFL Draft, JonLedyard.substacks.com. All the information there. John, appreciate you, my friend. Thank you so much for making some time for us today. Have a great weekend. Talk soon.
Absolutely, Jay. Thanks for having me. Always appreciate it.
You got it, pal.